entering. A few weeks ago, I spoke about Jesus, that is, the door. What do you do with the door? You close the door to keep things out. You open a door to step in, or a door can be opened and standing open just to invite people. But how do you enter? And I want to bring that back to the altar of incense. And I want to ask this question. Do you know how the high priest entered into the holiest of holies? Once a year? Have you ever thought about that? The high priest had incense in his one hand and a bowl of blood in his other hand. And he had to enter through a big vial once a year into the Holy of Holies. That means into the presence of a living God. But first he had to release the incense, and then he can go in with the blood. How did he do that? And it's very easy to understand that. All of us has got our own ideas, but God himself opened that veil so that the high priest could come in. Yes, it is possible to enter when God opens a door for you. But do you know how that veil actually come in? Do you know where it started? What's the origin of that veil? Because it wasn't always there. Then we have to look back at Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve had direct communion with God. It was so close that God came down in that soft breath in the evening, that soft wind, and he stepped in and he had communion, conversation, interaction with Adam and Eve. God longed to be with his people that he created, so much so that he actually came down to them. But then Adam and Eve sinned. Their 5 senses became stronger than their longing for God. The 5 senses for what is here on earth start to stand in the way. And then the veil was formed, and God had to remove them out of the garden to protect Adam and Eve. It wasn't there to say, this is a condemnation, you've done wrong, I'm going to put you outside. No, he protected them. Because if Adam and Eve ate of the tree of life at that stage, they would never have been able to get rid of sin. But God had to remove them, and a veil was placed because of the 5 senses, our body parts, that's so intertwined with this world that we cannot enter into the Holy of Holies, into the direct presence of God. Then Jesus came. And when Jesus died on the cross, he said, it is finished. The veil was torn. Not from the bottom, from the earth to heaven, but from heaven to earth. God himself opened a door for us to step back in. Jesus' body was the veil. And when he said it is finished, he said, I have submitted my 5 senses to God again. And now we as people, we as his children, can submit our 5 senses back to a living God and say, God, as I give my body part, and I've spoken about this a few weeks ago, but as you submit your body part, your 5 senses back to God, he opens the veil and says, now you can step in. How do I know that is true? Your prayer life is very important, as I've spoken last week. And that gives you direct access to God. And that brings the following. Hebrews 9 says the following. But inside, beyond the second curtain of the veil, there stood another tabernacle division known as the Holy of Holies. So the writer of the book of Hebrews says there is another. He's talking about the Holy of Holies. Now, if you read in the Old Testament, if you read about the Holy of Holies in the Old Testament, it says only the ark was in the Holy of Holies. But here in Hebrews 9, verse 4 and 5, we read, it had, that is in the Holy of Holies, it had the golden altar of incense and the ark, the chest of the covenant, covered over with gold. So what happened? Something happened after Jesus died. Before the time, the altar of incense were outside the veil, and the priest had to find a way, had to be cleansed and pure before God to go into the Holy of Holies. He had to wait until God opened that veil to step into the Holy of Holies. And the altar of incense symbolizes your prayer life. There was the hot coal. God is a consuming fire. But today, our prayer life gives us access into the Holy of Holies. And as prayer becomes part of your life, God said, I've opened the veil, so your prayers is now directly heard before God. You don't need to wait to go through the veil. You don't need to wait for me to open it up. I've already torn the veil. You've got the right now to step directly in to the Holy of Holies. God has made an opening, a door for you. Jesus' body was the veil that was torn through blood and sacrifice. And he said, now it is finished. Then he stood up and he gave his blood to the Father. That was a living sacrifice. And as we give our bodies and our prayers as a living sacrifice, God said, the veil has been torn. Your prayers are now directly in front of me. That is why we see that the altar of incense in the Old Testament is moved to the Holy of Holies. Your prayers, that is linked with the salt in your life, gives you direct access to the Holy of Holies. When you are in the presence of God, you will not be able to stand. If you are in the presence of a living God, you will experience the fullness of love. And it's very interesting. I had 2-3 experiences where I was in that Holy of Holy presence. And whenever you are there, there's nothing you can ask because you know that God knows your heart. You know that He answers your prayers. He knows every thought that you pray. When you are in that presence, there is only one thing that you can do, and that is to worship a living God. That is to give thanks to a God that is the King of the Kings, the Lord of the Lords, that's sitting on the throne. When you are in that holy place that is filled with the aroma of a living God, you know that God's ear is so close to your heart that every breath you take comes directly from Him. You don't try to breathe because you're alive. You breathe because He's giving His life to you. There is a way to enter into the Holy of Holies. There is a way that's been prepared for you to step into that fullness of God. You have direct access. Understand the altar of incense. Understand the prayers. Understand that the veil has been taken because Jesus is the door. And because Jesus is the door, your prayers, the altar of incense, has given you direct access into the Holy of Holies. May your prayer life become such a strong aroma for God that fullness of His life starts to penetrate your whole being, that you know, you've got free access to life, to breath, to fullness, to victory. Then you will know that death is not the enemy anymore. No, death is not an enemy. Death on earth is just the door to step into the fullness of God. You can, without dying, step into the fullness of God. Moses didn't die when he saw the fullness of God. He just stepped in and he saw God's face and he didn't die. Everybody believed that when you see God's face, you will die. Moses didn't. And so are we. We don't need to die. You can step in because the body of Jesus Christ, when he gave up his breath, the veil was torn and you've got an opening. You can enter freely if your prayer life, your communication, your love with God is to that fullness that you say, I'm a living sacrifice. I bless you with the fullness of God. I speak a blessing of an open door over your being, over your life, over your thought life, over your prayer life. May the fullness of a living God rest upon you every step of the way. You are alive in the presence of God as you start to worship Him. Shalom.